Is there such a thing as Catholic economics? In this video, I am going to be talking about Catholic social teaching and whether there really is truly a school of economics that ties to traditional Catholic values. The spoiler is not really, but as a disclosure, I am a practicing Catholic who is quite involved in his local Catholic community. So I do have a bias when I discuss topics related to the church and how they intersect with, generally, for those who are not familiar with, Catholic social teaching is the set of doctrine developed by the Catholic Church that basically explains principles to how to best build a just society and living a holy life amid challenges that develop as a result of modern economics, politics, and social issues that often bring challenges to the world and test the faith of the lay people. So basically, how does this relate to economics, though? Is there a Catholic social teaching related to economics? Yes and no. Really, it tells basically people who participate in the free market to factor in their Catholic ethics when making business decisions, such as factoring in human dignity, the common good, solidarity, which is the idea that you have interdependence and mutual responsibility for other members of society, and you need to care about the poor and the marginalized, subsidiarity, which is the idea that decisions should be made at the most local level possible, and you want to empower smaller communities, whether on the government or the business level, over national entities. Larger institutions should help support local efforts rather than replace them, and often the impersonality of large bureaucracies, whether it's in the government and corporate America, often provides an excuse to eschew ethics because there's really no individual person accountable for any questionable decisions. Also, there's an idea of sustainability built into that too. The key really is that in terms of Catholic social teaching related to economics is that it's just more of a way of how to do things, but not really to ascribe specific economic policy. There's no Catholic school of economics like there is an Austrian school or a Marxist school or a Keynesian school. And really the church's last major decision that really had an impact on really economic policy was its decision to get rid of the banning of interest-bearing loans. Because in the early church, up till about the 13th and 14th century, the Catholic Church prohibited all sort of money lending for interest because they thought it was usury. But as market forces evolved and the European business community realized that risk needed to be compensated or nobody would take the risk to finance things such as the exploration of the New World or rebuilding cities during the Renaissance or raising money to finance wars of defense, there really was a need to be able to incentivize lenders and investors to finance these projects. And people weren't just going to do it purely out of the kindness of their hearts. And the equity market wouldn't really be developed in what we would resemble the modern stock market until the 17th century. And so that's kind of how some of the drivers that motivated the Catholic Church to pivot in usury from being any interest-bearing loan to what is considered an excessive rate of interest. And really now the modern definition of usury is essentially when you charge interest rate well above the market rate given the level of risk for the project or the borrower. So you can still have higher interest rates for higher risk borrowers. That's why credit cards have higher interest than a mortgage payment does, because the lack of collateral and the inherent risk of lending consumer credit, or why smaller businesses often have to pay higher interest rates than AAA corporate bond companies do. So there's still room for that, but the difference is that if you had two people with similar profile of risk and the usurer is charging a much higher interest rate for one set of borrowers relative to the rest of the market would, or relative to another. And so that's the main big policy change that the Catholic Church has done when it comes to economics. But really since then, they've been more of just a guidepost of how to live ethically within the general free market economic system. And the reason I say the general free market economic system is because the Catholic Church, as far back as the 1890s, has been a staunch critic of authoritarian socialism and communism, mainly because of its lack of respecting individual human dignity and freedom. And actually, Pope John Paul and the Catholic Church was involved in a lot of the rhetoric against the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War and the fight against communism. So it's not simply just, I want to do what sounds like it's good for the poor on paper, like a lot of left-leaning progressives would, but they do care about the best interests of the poor, but mainly the sense of providing them aid, but with dignity. Like, it's better to help somebody find a job than to just give them a free handout, is a good example. And so some of the key themes about Catholic social teaching when it comes to economics is that Catholic social teaching is generally for fair wages and for employers not underpaying people or paying them below subsistence living. And labor generally is prioritized over capital as an expression of human dignity. In terms of unions, I don't think they generally support unions as long as each side is negotiating in good faith. The Catholic social teaching does embrace private property and ownership of private property, but with social responsibility. Like, with the ownership of land, you have the responsibility to be the best steward it can be. And economic justice, really, in the sense is that regulations should be fair and not be used to help the powerful do unethical things to the less powerful. And any sort of exploitation or gaming of the economic system is generally condemned. Yeah, and the state's really job is to regulate markets and protect the common good and support social welfare more in the broader sense, not really directly in the sense of social welfare payments. And generally, the idea is private charity has more meaning than public social services because of the voluntary nature of it. It shows that the faithful are actually making a difference themselves and self-sacrificing over just voting for somebody else to do it. Yeah. And they think private initiative is preferred, but public intervention is needed when the social justice is at risk otherwise, but more of as kind of a last resort. Global solidarity, really, this is kind of that it should apply globally, and developed nations have a moral responsibility to support the economic development of poor countries and those that are less economically developed. And if you want to read more about this kind of thing, there's some notable papal encyclicals, such as the Rerum Novarum by Pope Leo IX, which kind of lays down the foundations of this. And you had Pope Pius XI in 1931 wrote the criticisms of unregulated capitalism and of socialism and why the church doesn't really support either one. And then Pope John Paul sent Simius Annus, which kind of emphasizes the need for capitalism over communism, and to make sure, though, it's a balanced approach. Basically, it's very moderate. Like, if you had to put Catholic economics and Catholic social teaching like on the political spectrum, it would probably be more towards the political center in U.S. It's generally capitalism, but capitalism with humanitarian restraints. However, the Catholic Church is not endorsing candidates based on their economic policy. It's just some basic guidelines about how Catholics can maybe apply their social teaching to their private practices and how they participate in civil society. The closest thing to a Catholic school of economics, and I talked about this in my iceberg of economics, and distributionism's most notable advocate is G.K. Chesterton. And it is kind of inspired by some of these papal encyclicals that I mentioned earlier. And the main idea is that you should have private property, you should have a free market, and have competition, but subsidiarity needs to be emphasized over the most efficient outcomes. And really, by this mean for policy is that you have everything of the free market, except with much stronger antitrust laws. If you took this to its full extent, you basically would not allow industry consolidation, like no monopolies, no oligopolies. Every business needs to be done at the small and local level if possible, and you should have many competitors. And in theory, this sounds great. Like, more competition probably means lower prices, more competition for labor means better wages, and you have less income inequality and concentration to a few powerful people who own these larger businesses. And since the business world is more evenly distributed, it makes it harder for the government to get in cahoots with big companies or just control a few big companies to push its agenda. The one downside is there's certain industries where this doesn't make sense. Like, the example would be like electric and water utilities. They just inherently have natural monopolies. Or maybe super highly capital intensive businesses, such as airlines maybe, or infrastructure providers, that your typical small business owner could never get the financing to build one of those or compete. And you need economies of scale to make these big infrastructure projects or these very capital intensive businesses. Energy business is another example of this, just more affordable to the end consumer. The lack of scale would inherently actually provide a worse product and make the product more expensive. However, I mean, for industries that could have spent some room for competition, I think distributionism is entirely a bad idea. I don't really know any examples in any world economy that this has really been tried on a mass scale, so I can't really say the track record of it. But I think it's an interesting idea, and it's a better alternative than basically the new rebranding of Marxism that we have every 20 years or so from the left. And yeah, so that's kind of my thoughts on distributionism. I talked more about this in the iceberg of economics, but it's just in general, it's the most aggressively anti-consolidation ideology that there is. And it is the closest thing to an economic school based on Catholic social teaching. Overall, what are your thoughts on Catholic economics and distribution? And if you like these kind of topics, do you want me to do one about the finances of the Vatican and just how in general finances across the Catholic Church work? Let me know, and thank you for watching.